Detective Robert Kane pulled his patrol car into the parking lot of Wilson's supermarket, the same store he'd been shopping at for over 10 years. It was 6:30 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, and the lot was busy with people stopping by after work to grab groceries for dinner. Robert had just finished a long shift dealing with paperwork and was looking forward to getting home to his wife and kids. But first he needed to pick up milk and bread. Basic stuff that somehow always seemed to run out at the worst times. Robert was still wearing his civilian clothes, just a simple polo shirt and jeans, but his service weapon was holstered at his side as department policy required even when off duty. He'd been a cop for 15 years now, working his way up from patrol officer to detective. Most people in the neighborhood knew him and respected him. He thought of himself as a good cop, someone who kept the community safe. As he walked through, the automatic doors, the cool air conditioning hit him after the warm evening outside. The familiar smell of fresh bread from the bakery, mixed with the faint scent of cleaning products. It was a nice store, the kind of place that served the better part of town, where families felt safe shopping late into the evening. Robert grabbed a shopping cart and headed toward the dairy section first. The store was busier than usual, with people rushing around trying to get their shopping done before dinner time. Kids were whining about wanting candy, parents were checking their phones for grocery lists, and elderly customers were taking their time comparing prices. It was the normal chaos of everyday life that Robert had grown comfortable with over the years, but as he turned the corner past the pharmacy toward the electronics section, something caught his eye that made him pause. There was a tall black man in his 30s wearing a dark hoodie standing in front of the headphone display. The man seemed to be looking around a lot, picking up different boxes, putting them back down, and checking his phone repeatedly. Robert felt something twist in his stomach. Call it cop instinct, he told himself. After 15 years on the force, you develop a sense for when something doesn't feel right. This guy seemed nervous, fidgety. He was looking around too much, like he was checking to see if anyone was watching him. And what was someone like that doing in this particular store anyway? This wasn't exactly his neighborhood. The man in the hoodie picked up an expensive pair of wireless headphones, examined the box carefully, then looked around again before putting them back. Robert noticed the way he kept his hands in his pockets when he wasn't touching the merchandise. The hoodie was pulled up, partially covering his face. Everything about his body language screamed suspicious activity to Robert's trained eye. Robert abandoned his shopping cart and casually walked closer, pretending to look at phone cases while keeping the man in his peripheral vision. The stranger was now comparing two different headphone models, reading the descriptions on the back of the boxes. But Robert wasn't buying it. This looked exactly like someone casing the place, figuring out what was worth stealing and planning his next move. Agent Thomas Richardson was having the kind of day that made him question his life choices. He'd spent 8 hours in a stuffy conference room going over case files with local police departments, trying to coordinate a drug trafficking investigation that seemed to get more complicated every week. All he wanted now was to buy a decent pair of headphones so he could listen to music during his morning jogs without the cheap earbuds he'd been using falling out every 5 minutes. Thomas had been an FBI agent for 12 years, and he'd learned to appreciate the simple pleasures in life during his downtime. A good pair of headphones wasn't exactly a luxury purchase for someone with his salary, but he believed in buying quality items that would last. That's why he was taking his time, reading reviews on his phone and comparing features. He'd changed out of his work clothes as soon as he got to his hotel room, throwing on comfortable jeans, sneakers, and his favorite hoodie. After a long day of being professional and buttoned up, it felt good to dress casually and just be a regular person doing regular things. Thomas noticed that the store carried several brands he'd been researching online. He picked up a pair of Sony headphones, checked the price, then grabbed his phone to see if he could find them cheaper online. The reviews were mixed, so he put them back and picked up a different model. The Bose ones were more expensive but had better noise cancellation, which would be perfect for airplane flights. As he stood there reading the product descriptions, Thomas got the strange feeling that someone was watching him. It was the same sixth sense that had served him well during undercover operations. He glanced around casually, but didn't see anyone paying particular attention to him. The electronics section was busy with other customers looking at phones, tablets, and speakers. Still, the feeling persisted. Thomas had learned to trust his instincts over the years. Something felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. He decided to finish his shopping quickly and get back to his hotel. Tomorrow was going to be another long day of meetings and coordination calls. Robert had seen enough. This guy was definitely up to something. The way he kept checking his phone, looking around, handling expensive merchandise, it all added up to trouble. Robert had arrested enough shoplifters over the years to recognize the pattern. They always acted nervous, always kept checking to see if security was watching them. What bothered Robert most was how out of place this guy looked in Wilson's supermarket. This was a nice store in a good neighborhood where families shopped. People here worked hard for their money and deserved to feel safe when they went about their daily business. Robert took pride in keeping undesirable elements away from places like this. Robert pulled out his badge and walked directly toward the man in the hoodie. His heart was pumping now, adrenaline kicking in the way it always did when he was about to make a move. This was what being a cop was all about. Protecting innocent people from criminals who thought they could just waltz into any neighborhood and cause trouble. The man was still standing there with a pair of headphones in his hands when Robert approached. He looked younger up close, maybe early 30s, with an athletic build that suggested he was in good shape. But that didn't change anything. Some of the most dangerous criminals Robert had dealt with looked perfectly normal on the surface. Robert cleared his throat loudly and held up his badge where the man could see it clearly. The guy looked up with a surprised expression, like he hadn't expected to be confronted. That reaction alone confirmed Robert's suspicions. Innocent people didn't look shocked when police officers approached them in stores. What happened next would change both of their lives forever, though neither man could have predicted it in that moment. Robert was about to make the biggest mistake of his 15-year career, while Thomas was about to experience something that would test every ounce of his professional training and personal character. Robert stepped closer to the man in the hoodie, his badge held high enough for everyone nearby to see. His voice carried the authority that came from 15 years of dealing with criminals and troublemakers. "Excuse me, sir. I'm Detective Kane with Metro City Police. I need to see some identification." Thomas looked up from the headphones he was holding, genuinely confused by the sudden appearance of a police officer. He glanced around quickly, wondering if there was some kind of emergency he hadn't noticed. The store seemed normal. Families shopping, kids asking for snacks. The usual evening crowd. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I asked you for identification," Robert repeated, his tone becoming sharper. He could see the way this guy was trying to play innocent, acting like he didn't know exactly why he was being questioned. Robert had dealt with this type before. They always tried to turn things around and make the police officer look like the bad guy. Thomas felt his stomach drop as he realized what was happening. After 12 years as an FBI agent, he'd heard enough stories from colleagues to recognize the signs. This wasn't about any emergency or legitimate police business. This was about a black man shopping in a white neighborhood, and a cop who had made assumptions about what he was doing there. "Officer, I'm just shopping for headphones," Thomas said calmly, keeping his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Look, I don't have time for games," Robert shot back. "You've been acting suspicious since you walked in here. Looking around, checking your phone, handling expensive merchandise. I know what I'm seeing, so let's make this easy. And just show me your ID." A middle-aged woman pushing a cart full of groceries slowed down as she walked past, clearly trying to listen to what was happening. Her teenage daughter tugged on her arm, whispering, "Mom, come on." But the woman kept glancing back over her shoulder. Thomas could feel other shoppers starting to pay attention. This was exactly the kind of situation that could spiral out of control quickly if he wasn't careful. He'd been trained in de-escalation techniques, but it was different when you were the target instead of the one in control. "Officer, I understand. You're just doing your job," Thomas said, choosing his words carefully. "But I haven't broken any laws. I'm a federal agent and I'm here on personal business." Robert let out a short laugh that had no humor in it. "Right. A federal agent, that's a new one." He'd heard every excuse in the book over the years, but this guy had some nerve trying to claim he was law enforcement. I suppose you have some kind of badge to prove that? As a matter of fact, I do, Thomas replied. He slowly moved his hand toward his back pocket where he kept his FBI credentials. I'm going to reach for my wallet to show you my identification. But Robert's hand was already moving to his weapon. The moment he saw the man reach toward his waistband, every alarm bell in his head started ringing. 15 years of training kicked in, along with all the stories he'd heard about officers who didn't react fast enough and paid for it with their lives. Don't move, Robert shouted, his gun clearing the holster in one smooth motion. Keep your hands where I can see them. Thomas froze instantly, his hand halfway to his wallet. Time seemed to slow down as he stared at the barrel of the gun pointed directly at his chest. Around them, the normal sounds of the grocery store, shopping carts, rolling, children talking, the beeping of checkout scanners, and him suddenly seemed impossibly loud. Hands up! Now! Robert commanded, his voice echoing through the electronics section. A woman nearby screamed and grabbed her young son, pulling him behind a display of phone cases. Other shoppers stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at the scene unfolding in front of them. Someone dropped a jar of pasta sauce, and the sound of breaking glass added to the chaos. Thomas slowly raised his hands, keeping them clearly visible. His training took over, the same calm voice he'd used in dangerous situations throughout his career. Officer, please listen to me. I'm FBI Special Agent Thomas Richardson. My credentials are in my back pocket. I'm not armed, and I'm not a threat to anyone. Shut up, Robert yelled, his gun steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. I don't want to hear any more lies. Get on the ground, now. Officer, please. Thomas tried again, his voice remaining calm even as his heart pounded. There are children here. Let's just talk about this calmly. But Robert wasn't listening. All he could see was a dangerous suspect who had tried to reach for what could have been a weapon. This was exactly the kind of situation they'd warned him about in training. Criminals who looked normal on the surface but were ready to attack the moment your guard was down. I said get on the ground, Robert shouted again. Face down, hands behind your head. An elderly man with a walking cane had been browsing nearby tablets when the confrontation started. Now he stood frozen, unsure whether to run or stay put. His hands shook as he gripped his cane, remembering stories his grandson had told him about police shootings he'd seen on the news. Thomas knew he had no choice but to comply. With cameras everywhere and innocent people watching, the last thing he wanted was for this situation to end in violence. Slowly, carefully, he began to lower himself to the ground. Don't hurt him, someone called out from behind a nearby aisle. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Robert's head snapped toward the voice. Everyone stay back, this is police business. A teenage girl had pulled out her phone and was recording the entire scene. Her mother noticed and tried to grab the phone away from her, but the girl stepped back, keeping the camera focused on the man lying face down on the supermarket floor with a gun pointed at him. Please, officer, Thomas said from the ground, his cheek pressed against the cold linoleum floor. Check my credentials. Call my supervisor. This is all just a misunderstanding. But Robert wasn't ready to listen to reason. In his mind, he had successfully stopped a potential criminal from whatever he had been planning. The fact that the man was now claiming to be a federal agent only made Robert more suspicious. Real FBI agents didn't shop for electronics and hoodies. They wore suits and carried themselves differently. More shoppers had gathered now, forming a loose circle around the scene but staying well back from the officer with the drawn weapon. Whispered conversations started among the crowd as people tried to figure out what had happened and whether the man on the ground had really done something wrong. What none of them knew was that this confrontation was about to take an even more dramatic turn when someone who could change everything was about to walk through those same automatic doors. Police Chief Victoria Martinez was reviewing budget reports in her office when her radio crackled to life with an urgent message that made her blood run cold. Chief, we have an officer-involved incident at Wilson's Supermarket on Oak Street. Detective Kane has drawn his weapon on a suspect. Multiple witnesses present. Victoria dropped her pen and grabbed her keys. In her 22 years with the Metro City Police Department, she'd learned that the words officer-involved incident could mean anything from a justified arrest to a career-ending disaster. But something about this particular call bothered her. Detective Robert Kane wasn't known for reckless behavior, but he also wasn't known for excellent judgment when it came to community relations. As she drove toward the supermarket, Victoria's mind raced through the possibilities. Wilson's was in a quiet neighborhood where serious crimes rarely happened. What could possibly require drawing a weapon in a grocery store on a Tuesday evening? She'd worked hard to build trust between the police department and the community over the past 5 years as chief. The last thing she needed was an incident that would undo all that progress. The parking lot was already filling with curious onlookers when Victoria arrived. She could see people standing outside the store, talking in small groups and pointing toward the entrance. Some were holding phones, clearly recording whatever was happening inside. Victoria's stomach dropped. In today's world, every police interaction could become viral news within minutes. As she walked through the automatic doors, Victoria immediately spotted the crowd gathered in the electronics section. She could hear Robert's voice shouting commands, and her heart sank even further. The tone was all wrong, too aggressive, too escalated for whatever situation he was dealing with. "Everyone step back," Victoria called out as she approached, her voice carrying the authority that came with years of leadership. "This is Chief Martinez. I need space to assess the situation." The crowd parted reluctantly, many people keeping their phones trained on the scene. Victoria could see Robert standing over a man lying face down on the floor, his service weapon still drawn and pointed downward. The man on the ground was wearing jeans and a dark hoodie, his hands clasped behind, his head in the classic position of someone who'd been ordered to surrender. "Detective Kane," Victoria said firmly. "Report." Robert glanced up at his chief, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Chief, I observed this suspect acting suspiciously in the electronics section. When I approached for identification, he reached toward his waistband. I perceived an imminent threat and drew my weapon to protect myself and the civilians in the area." Victoria studied the scene more carefully. The man on the ground wasn't moving except to breathe. His clothing didn't appear to conceal any obvious weapons. There was no sign of stolen merchandise or any indication of what he might have done to warrant this level of force. "Sir," Victoria said, addressing the man on the ground. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "No, ma'am," came the calm response. "I'm not injured, but I would appreciate if someone could check my credentials. I'm FBI Special Agent Thomas Richardson, badge number 2847. I was shopping for headphones when this situation began." Victoria felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. The name was familiar, and as she looked more closely at the man's profile, recognition dawned. She'd met Special Agent Richardson 3 months ago during a joint task force meeting about drug trafficking. He'd been professional, knowledgeable, and had helped coordinate several successful operations between federal and local law enforcement. "Detective Kane," Victoria said slowly, "step back and holster your weapon immediately." Robert looked confused. "Chief, this suspect claims to be—" "I said, holster your weapon," Victoria interrupted, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Now." Reluctantly, Robert slid his gun back into its holster, but he kept his hand near it, ready to draw again if needed. "Chief, I don't think you understand the situation here." Victoria knelt down next to Thomas, careful to keep her voice calm and professional. "Agent Richardson, with your permission, I'd like to retrieve your credentials to verify your identity." "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied. "My FBI credentials are in my back right pocket. My personal wallet with driver's license is in my back left pocket." Carefully, Victoria reached into Thomas's back pocket and withdrew a leather credential case. She opened it to reveal an official FBI badge and identification card with Thomas's photo, clearly showing his status as a special agent with 12 years of service. The crowd that had gathered let out a collective gasp as Victoria held up the credentials for everyone to see. Murmurs rippled through the group of onlookers, with people shaking their heads and some expressing outrage at what they'd witnessed. "Agent Richardson," Victoria said, helping him to his feet. "On behalf of the Metro City Police Department, I sincerely apologize for this incident. Are you certain you don't require medical attention?" Thomas dusted off his clothes and straightened his hoodie. Despite the humiliation and anger he felt, his training kept him composed. "I'm fine, Chief Martinez, though I think we need to have a serious conversation about what just happened here." Robert stood nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "Chief, I had no way of knowing." "Detective Kane," Victoria cut him off sharply, "you will remain silent until I address you directly." She turned back to Thomas. "Agent Richardson, I want you to know that this behavior does not represent the standards of our department." An elderly woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice shaking with indignation. "That poor man wasn't doing anything wrong, we all saw it. He was just looking at headphones like the rest of us." The teenager who had been recording on her phone stepped forward. "I got the whole thing on video. The officer never gave him a chance to explain anything. He just started yelling and pointing his gun." Victoria closed her eyes briefly, knowing that this incident was about to become much bigger than just a departmental matter. With multiple witnesses and video evidence, there would be no way to quietly handle this situation internally. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced to the crowd, "I want to assure you that this matter will be thoroughly investigated. However, I need to ask everyone to give us space to handle this appropriately." Most of the crowd began to disperse, though many people continued to linger near the entrance watching from a distance. The teenage girl with the phone remained, clearly planning to keep recording whatever happened next. Victoria turned her attention back to Robert, her expression stern. "Detective Kane, I want you to explain to me exactly what you observed that made you believe Agent Richardson posed a threat to anyone in this store." Robert's mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to find words that would justify his actions. "Chief, he looked suspicious. The way he was acting, checking his phone, looking around. And when I asked for ID, he reached for his waistband. He reached for his wallet," Victoria corrected, "which is exactly what any reasonable person would do when asked for identification by a police officer." Thomas finally spoke up, his voice steady but firm. "Chief Martinez, I need you to understand that this wasn't about suspicious behavior. I was shopping for headphones. I was comparing prices and reading reviews on my phone, which is what any consumer would do. The only thing that made me suspicious to Detective Kane was the color of my skin." The words hung in the air like a challenge that no one could ignore. Robert's face flushed red as he realized that everyone present, his chief, the FBI agent, and any remaining witnesses, understood exactly what had happened here. Victoria knew that the next few minutes would determine not just Robert's future with the department, but also the community's trust in law enforcement for years to come. The decision she was about to make would send a message that would echo far beyond the walls of Wilson's supermarket. Chief Victoria Martinez stood in the middle of Wilson's supermarket, surrounded by witnesses who had just watched one of her officers draw a weapon on an innocent FBI agent. The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. 22 years of police work had taught her that some decisions would define not just a career, but the entire reputation of an organization. She looked at Robert Kane, a detective who had served under her command for 3 years since she became chief. He was sweating now, his face pale as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. His eyes darted between her, Agent Richardson, and the crowd of people still watching from a respectful distance. "Detective Kane," Victoria said, her voice carrying across the electronics section clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Remove your badge and place it on the counter." Robert's eyes widened in shock. "Chief, wait, can't we discuss this privately? I made an honest mistake. I was trying to protect people." "An honest mistake?" Victoria repeated, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You drew your weapon on an unarmed federal agent who was shopping for headphones. You forced him to the ground in front of families and children based on nothing more than racial profiling." The teenage girl with the phone took a step closer, making sure her camera captured every word. This was the kind of moment that could change everything, and she knew it. Her mother had stopped trying to pull her away and was now watching with the same intense focus as everyone else. "Chief, please," Robert said, his voice cracking slightly. "I've been a good cop for 15 years. I've served this community faithfully. One mistake shouldn't end my career." Agent Richardson stepped forward, his demeanor calm but firm. Detective Kane, this wasn't a mistake. You saw a black man in a store and decided I didn't belong here. You escalated a non-situation into a life-threatening encounter. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. Victoria nodded slowly, appreciating how Thomas was handling this situation with such professionalism despite what he'd endured. It reminded her why federal agents were often brought in to handle sensitive cases. They had the training and temperament to stay focused on facts rather than emotions. Detective Kane, Victoria continued, your badge. Now. With trembling hands, Robert unpinned his badge from his shirt and placed it on the glass counter next to a display of phone cases. The small piece of metal made a soft clink as it hit the surface, a sound that seemed to echo through the store despite all the background noise. Your service weapon as well, Victoria added. Robert hesitated for a moment, then slowly drew his gun and placed it next to his badge. His hand lingered over the weapon for a second as if he couldn't quite believe this was really happening. An older man who had been shopping for batteries when the incident started spoke up from the crowd. Good. About time police departments started holding their officers accountable. His comment was met with nods and murmurs of agreement from several other witnesses. Victoria turned to address the gathered crowd directly. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that what you witnessed here today is completely unacceptable and does not represent the values of the Metro City Police Department. As of this moment, Detective Kane is terminated from his position. The words hit Robert like a physical blow. He staggered backwards slightly, grabbing onto a display rack to steady himself. Chief, you can't do this. I have rights. I have a family to support, 20 years until retirement. You should have thought about your family before you decided to terrorize an innocent man, Victoria replied coldly. You should have thought about your retirement before you violated every principle of professional policing and human decency. Agent Richardson watched this exchange with mixed feelings. Part of him felt satisfaction that there were immediate consequences for Robert's actions. But another part of him, the part that understood how difficult it was to be a law enforcement officer, felt a small measure of sympathy for a man whose career was ending in such spectacular fashion. The store manager, a nervous man in his 50s, who had been watching from behind the customer service counter, finally approached the group. Chief Martinez, is it safe for customers to continue shopping? Should we close the store? Victoria looked around at the scene. The immediate crisis was over, but she knew the aftermath was just beginning. The store can remain open, but I'd recommend clearing this area for a while. We'll need to conduct interviews with witnesses. The teenage girl with the phone stepped forward boldly. Chief, I recorded the whole thing. Do you want to see the video? Victoria nodded. Yes, we'll need copies of any recordings as part of our investigation. But I also want you to know that what you did today, documenting this incident, was important. Truth matters, and sometimes it takes brave citizens to make sure the truth comes to light. Robert was still standing by the counter, looking lost and confused. The badge and gun that had defined his identity for 15 years were sitting there, like evidence of a crime. Chief, this is my life. This job is all I know. Can't we work something out? Detective Kane, Victoria said, her voice softening slightly but remaining firm. You had a choice today. You could have approached Agent Richardson respectfully. You could have listened when he tried to explain who he was. You could have de-escalated instead of escalating. But you chose to see a threat where none existed, and you chose to use force against an innocent person. Those choices have consequences. A woman pushing a cart with a young child spoke up from the edge of the crowd. Thank you, Chief. My son was terrified when he saw that man with a gun. He asked me why the police officer was being mean to someone who wasn't doing anything wrong. I didn't know what to tell him. Victoria knelt down to the child's eye level. You can tell your son that police officers are supposed to protect people, not scare them. And when we make mistakes, we have to take responsibility for them. Agent Richardson cleared his throat. Chief Martinez, I appreciate how you've handled this situation, but I need you to understand that this incident will require a federal investigation. The FBI takes civil rights violations very seriously, especially when they involve law enforcement officers. Victoria nodded grimly. I understand, Agent Richardson. We'll cooperate fully with any federal investigation. And I want you to know that our department will be implementing additional training and oversight measures to ensure this never happens again. Robert looked up sharply at the mention of federal charges. Civil rights violations? Chief, you're talking about sending me to prison over a misunderstanding. No, Thomas interjected. I'm talking about holding you accountable for violating my constitutional rights. You don't get to threaten someone's life because you don't like the way they look. The crowd began to thin out as people realized the immediate drama was over, but many lingered in other parts of the store, clearly discussing what they'd witnessed. Victoria knew that by tomorrow morning, this incident would be all over social media and local news. Detective Kane, Victoria said finally, you need to leave the premises immediately. You'll be contacted about the investigation procedures and your final paperwork. Do you have someone who can drive you home? Robert nodded slowly, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. His 15-year career was over, and everyone in his department would know about it by the end of the shift. The thought of facing his wife and children with this news made him feel sick to his stomach. As Robert walked toward the exit, the weight of his actions finally began to hit him fully. This wasn't just about losing a job. This was about becoming the kind of police officer that people protested against, the kind that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. Agent Richardson watched him go, then turned to Chief Martinez. What happens now will determine whether this community trusts law enforcement going forward. I hope you understand how important that is. Victoria looked around the store one more time, at the witnesses who were still processing what they'd seen, at the teenage girl who had captured it all on video, at the families who had been shopping for groceries and ended up witnessing a moment that would change everything. Agent Richardson, she said quietly, I understand perfectly, and I intend to make sure that change starts today. 3 weeks after the incident at Wilson's supermarket, the teenage girl's video had been viewed over 2 million times across various social media platforms. The footage showed everything, from Robert Kane's initial confrontation to Chief Victoria Martinez stripping him of his badge in front of dozens of witnesses. Unlike many police videos that sparked controversy and debate, this one was clear, cut. There was no room for different interpretations of what had happened. Agent Thomas Richardson sat in his hotel room, reading through news articles about the incident on his laptop. The headlines ranged from Police Chief Takes Swift Action Against Racist Officer to FBI Agent Terrorized While Shopping. Some praised Chief Martinez for her decisive leadership, while others questioned whether the punishment was too severe for what they called a judgment error. Thomas had given interviews to 3 different news outlets, always careful to remain professional and focus on the broader issues rather than his personal experience. He knew that his response would set the tone for how this incident was remembered, and what changes might come from it. The phone in his hotel room rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Chief Martinez calling with an update he'd been waiting for. Agent Richardson, I wanted to let you know that the district attorney has filed formal charges against former Detective Kane, Victoria said, her voice tired but determined. He's being charged with violating your civil rights under federal law, plus assault and abuse of power under state law. Thomas leaned back in his chair, processing the news. How's he taking it? About as well as you'd expect, Victoria replied. His lawyer is claiming it was an honest mistake and that charging him criminally is excessive, but the evidence is pretty clear, especially with multiple witnesses in that video. Robert Kane had spent the past 3 weeks watching his life fall apart piece by piece. The video of his confrontation with Agent Richardson had been shared thousands of times, often with commentary about police racism and abuse of power. His neighbors knew what he'd done. His children's classmates had seen the footage. His wife had asked him to move out while she figured out whether their marriage could survive this scandal. The legal bills were mounting, and no other police department would even consider hiring him. At 43 years old, with only law enforcement experience on his resume, Robert was facing the possibility of starting over completely, assuming he didn't end up in federal prison. His lawyer had advised him to consider a plea deal, but Robert still struggled to accept that his actions warranted criminal charges. In his mind, he'd been doing his job the way he'd been trained. The fact that everyone else saw it as blatant racism was something he was still trying to understand. Meanwhile, Chief Martinez was working 18-hour days implementing reforms that she hoped would prevent future incidents like this one. She'd called in experts from around the country to help redesign the department's training programs, focusing heavily on unconscious bias and de-escalation techniques. The changes went far beyond training. Victoria had established a civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate complaints against officers. She'd implemented mandatory body cameras for all officers and created a new policy requiring officers to intervene when they witnessed misconduct by their colleagues. But perhaps most importantly, she'd started holding regular community meetings where residents could voice their concerns directly to police leadership. The first meeting had been tense, with many community members expressing years of frustration about how they'd been treated by police officers. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly black woman who'd lived in the neighborhood for 30 years, stood up during one of these meetings to share her story. "My grandson is the same age as that FBI agent," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "He could have been the one on that supermarket floor with a gun pointed at him. The only difference is that he doesn't have a federal badge to protect him." Her words resonated throughout the packed community center, reminding everyone that Agent Richardson's experience wasn't unique. It was just the one that happened to be captured on video and involved someone with enough authority to demand accountability. Agent Richardson had stayed in town longer than originally planned, working with Chief Martinez to develop new training protocols based on his experience as both a federal agent and a victim of police misconduct. Their collaboration had started out as a professional courtesy, but had evolved into something more meaningful. "The key thing people need to understand," Thomas explained during one of their planning sessions, "is that this wasn't about me being an FBI agent. This was about me being a black man in a space where someone decided I didn't belong. The badge only mattered after the fact." Victoria nodded, taking notes as they discussed specific scenarios that could be included in training exercises. "We need officers to understand that their assumptions about people can be dangerous and wrong, but we also need to give them practical tools for checking those assumptions before they act on them." The new training program they developed included role-playing exercises where officers practiced approaching citizens in various scenarios. They brought in community members to help design these exercises, ensuring they reflected real-life situations that people in the neighborhood actually experienced. One of the most powerful additions was a session where officers had to experience being on the receiving end of an aggressive police encounter. Local actors played the role of officers while real police officers experienced what it felt like to be questioned, searched, and treated with suspicion for no clear reason. Detective Lisa Wong had been with the department for 8 years and was initially skeptical about the new training. "We already know not to be racist," she told her partner during a break. "This feels like we're being punished for what Kane did." But after going through the role-playing exercise where she was treated as a suspicious person, Lisa's perspective began to shift. "I had no idea how powerless it feels," she admitted to the group afterward. "Even though I knew it was just training, my heart was racing. I kept thinking about how much worse it would be if this was real and I didn't have any authority to make it stop." The changes weren't limited to training and policy. Chief Martinez had also worked with City Council to establish a fund for community programs focused on police-community relations. Part of the money went toward youth programs that brought teenagers and police officers together for positive interactions like sports leagues and mentorship programs. Agent Richardson had been particularly interested in these youth programs, remembering his own complicated relationship with police officers when he was growing up. "Kids need to see police officers as people who are there to help them, not as threats to be feared," he explained to a group of officers who would be volunteering as mentors. 6 months after the incident, the changes in Metro City's police department were becoming visible to residents. Complaints against officers had dropped by 40%, while community satisfaction surveys showed improvement in nearly every category. The teenage girl who had recorded the original incident, Ashley Chen, had become something of a local celebrity. She'd been invited to speak at schools about the importance of documenting injustice and standing up for what's right. Her video had sparked conversations in classrooms across the country about racism police accountability, and the power of citizen journalism. "I never thought my phone video would change anything," Ashley said during one of her school